let me introduce you to Carl Tanzler, probably the most unsettling definition of hopeless romantic you'll ever hear. Born in Germany in 1877, Carl wasn't your average guy. He claimed to be a genius with 9 degrees. Spoiler, he didn't have any. Dabbled in inventions, and swore up and down that a ghostly ancestor visited him in dreams. Why? To show him visions of his destined love, a dark-haired woman so perfect that no living human could ever compare. And with that level of delusion, Carl was already starting to veer off course. Hooked already? Smash that subscribe button and stick with Talescape. Fast forward to the late 1920s. Carl had ditched his wife and 2 daughters in Germany. Because, of course, why let responsibility get in the way of a love prophecy? He moved to the U.S. and landed in Key West, Florida, where he found a job as a radiology technician at the Marine Hospital. And here's where things start getting weird. Carl wasn't just good at his job, he was obsessive about it. The man treated X-ray machines like magical tools, but his real fixation was still out there. His dream girl, the one he'd been obsessing over for years. And then in 1930, she walked in, or at least Carl thought she did. Enter Maria Elena de Hoyos, a stunning 21-year-old Cuban-American woman. Carl took one look at her and froze. In his mind, this was it. She wasn't just a patient, she was the woman from his visions. Forget professionalism. Carl was practically ready to start planning the wedding on the spot. But there was a problem. Elena wasn't there for a casual checkup. She had tuberculosis. Back then, TB was like the Grim Reaper's favorite side hustle, and Elena's chances weren't great. Carl, though, he didn't care. He declared himself her personal doctor, which, let's be honest, was a bit of a stretch for an X-ray guy, and swore he could save her. Carl threw everything he had at her treatment: experimental tonics, bizarre electrical contraptions, even gifts like jewelry and dresses. It was less medicine and more full-on obsession. He visited Elena's home constantly, showering her with attention and promises of a miracle cure. Her family thought he was eccentric, but well-meaning, so they let him help. And Elena? Well, she didn't exactly swoon over Carl's relentless devotion. She was battling a terminal illness and had enough on her plate without entertaining a love-struck 50-something-year-old. Still, Carl remained undeterred. In his mind, they were destined for each other, no matter how one-sided the feelings were. Despite Carl's over-the-top efforts, Elena's condition worsened. On October 25, 1931, she passed away at just 22 years old. Most people would have mourned, paid their respects, and moved on. But Carl Tanzler wasn't most people. To him, Elena's death wasn't the end, it was just the beginning of his twisted love story. After Elena's death, most people would have grieved, maybe sent flowers and moved on. But Carl Tanzler? Oh, he had other plans. He paid for a fancy, above-ground mausoleum to house her body, convincing her family it was a grand gesture of respect. What they didn't know was that Carl had a key. Yep, he built himself a private entrance to Elena's final resting place so he could visit her whenever he wanted. And visit he did, every single night. Armed with gifts, Carl would sit by her coffin, whispering sweet nothings, and even serenading her with Spanish love songs. It wasn't just mourning, it was a full-blown ritual. He spent hours by her side, convinced that death was merely a temporary inconvenience in their cosmic love story. But Carl wasn't satisfied with just visiting Elena. Over time, his obsession festered into something far more disturbing. In 1933, 2 years after her death, he decided he couldn't bear to leave her in that mausoleum any longer. So, one moonlit night, Carl crept into the tomb, retrieved her body, and smuggled it back to his house. How? Using a toy wagon. Yes, the man rolled her corpse through the streets of Key West like he was taking groceries home. Back at his house, Carl got to work. Keeping a decomposing body intact was no small task, and let's just say Carl's methods were inventive. First, he wired her bones together with piano strings to make sure she didn't fall apart. Then, as her skin began to decay, he replaced it with a mix of silk cloth, wax, and plaster. Her face? Glass eyes to replace her real ones, and a wig made from her own hair that Carl had collected from her family. And the smell? Well, Carl tried to combat that too. He doused her body in copious amounts of disinfectant, formaldehyde, and perfume. His house must have smelled like a combination of a science lab and a perfume counter gone horribly wrong. Carl didn't just preserve Elena's body, he made her a part of his daily life. He dressed her in fine clothes, adorned her with jewelry, and even propped her up at the dinner table. To Carl, this wasn't a corpse, it was his wife in all but legal paperwork. He slept beside her every night, talked to her, and even claimed they danced together. Meanwhile, Carl's neighbors were starting to notice something was off. The man rarely left his house, and when he did, he bought an alarming amount of perfume. People whispered about the strange smell wafting from his property, but no one could have guessed the truth. It wasn't until 1940, 7 years after Carl brought Elena's body home, that his macabre secret finally unraveled. Elena's sister, Florinda, had heard rumors about Carl's companion and decided to confront him. When she arrived at his house, Carl proudly showed her what he'd been hiding. Florinda fled in horror and immediately alerted the authorities. When the police arrived, they were greeted with a sight straight out of a horror movie. Elena's body, now barely recognizable as human, lay in Carl's bed, meticulously preserved like some grotesque doll. The officers were stunned, and Carl, he acted like it was the most normal thing in the world. End of part 2. When the police removed Elena's body from Carl's house, it was like ripping the lid off a Pandora's box of horror. News of the macabre discovery spread like wildfire, turning Carl Tanzler into an overnight sensation. Headlines couldn't get enough of the bizarre tale. Mad scientist, grave robber, and lover beyond the grave were just a few of the titles splashed across newspapers. People were both horrified and fascinated by this man who had lived with a corpse for 7 years. Carl was arrested and charged with wantonly and maliciously destroying a grave and removing a body without authorization. Basically, they got him for corpse theft, which, as bizarre as it sounds, wasn't even considered a major crime at the time. The trial was a media circus, with people packing the courtroom just to get a glimpse of the man who had turned obsession into an art form. Carl, for his part, didn't seem the least bit ashamed. He defended his actions with shocking sincerity, claiming he had done it all out of love. He even admitted that he had been planning to bring Elena back to life. That's right, this man had been working on a homemade resurrection machine complete with electric coils and Tesla-inspired gadgets because apparently, Carl thought he could outsmart death with spare parts and blind devotion. But the most shocking twist? Public opinion wasn't entirely against him. Some people, yes, actual living, breathing humans, saw Carl's actions as a tragically romantic gesture. Letters poured in from fans, mostly women, who praised his undying love. One admirer even sent him a marriage proposal. Because nothing says husband material like 7 years of corpse cuddling, right? Meanwhile, poor Elena's family was left reeling. Not only had they lost their daughter, but they also had to endure the humiliation of her being paraded through the headlines as the centerpiece of Carl's deranged fantasy. After the trial, her body was reburied in an unmarked grave to ensure it would never be disturbed again. And Carl? Well, thanks to a legal technicality, the statute of limitations, he walked free. Yep, he dodged any serious punishment and went right back to his eccentric ways. He moved to Zephyr Hills, Florida, where he lived alone in a small house. But Carl wasn't ready to let go of Elena, even in spirit. He built a life-sized effigy of her out of wax and plaster, complete with her signature dark hair and his disturbing version of her features. He lived with the replica until his death in 1952, found clutching the effigy like it was his one true love. The story of Carl Tanzler and Elena de Hoyos became a cultural phenomenon, retold in books, documentaries, and even morbid jokes at dinner parties. But beneath the sensational headlines lies a tragic core. Elena was a young woman whose life was cut short by disease, only to have her memory hijacked by a man who couldn't let go. If there's one takeaway from this tale, it's that obsession can twist even the most human emotion into something unrecognizable. Carl Tanzler's story isn't just a cautionary tale. It's a stark reminder that some lines are meant to stay uncrossed. Thanks for tuning into Talescape. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that leave you asking, what did I just listen to?